Have you ever wondered why China built thousands of 1950s Soviet jet designs well into the 21st century? Or how a fighter so obsolete that even North Korea rejected it became one of history's most produced aircraft? Well, strap in, because the Chengdu J-7 is China's endless MiG-21 copy that refused to die for 50 years. Today, we're revealing 15 shocking facts about this primitive interceptor that China kept building not for military capability, but to keep factories employed. And number one will expose the absurd economic reason behind this madness. Hit that like button, subscribe for more, and let's expose this Cold War relic. 15. Soviet MiG-21 clone. The J-7 is a direct copy of the Soviet MiG-21 fishbed interceptor. The USSR provided China with blueprints and technical documentation in the early 1960s as part of socialist cooperation before the Sino-Soviet split. China began license production, copying every aspect of the design exactly. This became the foundation of China's jet fighter industry. The J-7 is essentially a MiG-21 with Chinese manufacturing and minor modifications. It's one of the most blatant examples of technology transfer in aviation history. China took the Soviet design and produced it for decades, beyond when the original became obsolete. The J-7 represents China's early aerospace industry built entirely on copying foreign technology without indigenous innovation or significant improvements to the basic 1950s Soviet design. 14. Nose intake limitation. The J-7's giant nose air intake creates a fundamental design flaw that plagued the aircraft forever. The massive intake feeding the engine occupies the entire nose, leaving no room for a proper radar system. Fighter radars need to be in the nose for optimal coverage, but the intake blocks this completely. Some variants mounted tiny radars above the intake or in the intake cone, but these were compromised and ineffective. Pilot forward visibility was also obstructed by the intake structure. This aerodynamic design from the 1950s prioritized engine airflow over sensors and situational awareness. The layout made sense for early jets but became crippling as radar technology advanced. Modern fighters need sophisticated nose radars. The J-7's design made this impossible without complete redesign. China was stuck with this fundamental limitation throughout 50 years of production. 13. Tiny combat radius. The J-7's combat radius was pathetically small, barely 300 kilometers with typical loadout. This made it useful only as a point defense interceptor defending its own airbase. Offensive operations were impossible due to insufficient range. Chinese pilots joked it was an airport defender that couldn't venture far from home. The small internal fuel capacity and inefficient engine meant the jet burned through fuel rapidly. External fuel tanks helped, but reduced performance and defeated the purpose of a lightweight interceptor. Compare this to modern fighters with 1,000-plus kilometer combat radius. The J-7 could defend local airspace but couldn't project power or conduct deep strikes. This range limitation meant it was strategically useless for anything beyond homeland defense, making it obsolete for modern warfare requiring mobility and reach. 12. Exported everywhere. Despite being obsolete and primitive, the J-7 was sold to over 20 countries worldwide. It became the cheapest fighter jet available on the international market. Poor nations that couldn't afford Western or even Soviet aircraft bought Chinese J-7s. Countries like Albania, Bangladesh, Egypt, Iran, Iraq, Myanmar, Nigeria, North Korea, small numbers, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Sudan, Tanzania, and Zimbabwe all operated J-7s. The quality was terrible, reliability was questionable, but the price was unbeatable. China undercut all competitors on cost, making the J-7 the fighter of choice for developing nations. This international success came not from capability but pure affordability. It gave impoverished air forces something with wings and missiles, even if it couldn't compete with modern aircraft. Economic desperation on both sides drove these sales. 11. Production never stopped. The J-7 was manufactured continuously from the 1960s until 2013. That's over 50 years of production of a 1950s design. China built thousands of J-7s across numerous variants during this half-century. The production run outlasted the original Soviet MiG-21 by decades. Even as the jet became hopelessly obsolete, Chinese factories kept building them year after year. This wasn't military necessity. China had much better fighters available. It was industrial policy keeping aircraft factories employed and production lines active. The government couldn't shut down production without massive unemployment at state-owned enterprises. So they kept building J-7s nobody needed, stockpiling them or selling them to desperately poor countries. It's one of the longest production runs in aviation history, driven entirely by economic and political factors rather than military requirements. 10. Coffin corner. Danger. The J-7 had a dangerous aerodynamic characteristic called coffin corner at high altitudes. The stall speed and maximum speed became dangerously close together at altitude, leaving pilots with a tiny margin for error. Fly too slow and you stall. Fly too fast and you exceed structural limits or lose control. This narrow envelope at high altitude made the aircraft treacherous to operate. Pilots had to maintain precise speed constantly or face loss of control. Many accidents resulted from pilots inadvertently entering this regime during combat maneuvering or intercept missions. The swept delta wing design created this problem, inherited directly from the MiG-21's aerodynamics. Modern fighters have much wider flight envelopes with computer assistance. The J-7's coffin corner was an aerodynamic trap built into the design that killed pilots throughout its service life. 9. Western avionics upgrade. Later J-7 variants incorporated Western avionics because China couldn't build adequate electronics domestically. Italian Galileo Avionica and British GEC Marconi systems were installed in export versions. This created the bizarre situation of a Soviet-designed airframe with NATO electronics. The F-7M and F-7P variants for export featured Western radar, fire control, and cockpit displays. China recognized their indigenous avionics were inferior and bought foreign systems to make the aircraft marginally competitive. This East-West hybrid showed China's technological limitations in electronics and sensors during the 1980s and 1990s. The Western upgrades improved capability significantly, but couldn't overcome the fundamental airframe limitations. It was lipstick on a pig, making an obsolete jet slightly less obsolete. The fact that China needed Western technology to upgrade a Soviet copy reveals their aerospace industry's weaknesses during this period. 8. Pakistan's main fighter. Pakistan operated hundreds of J-7s as a significant portion of their fighter fleet for decades. The Pakistan Air Force flew them in combat against India multiple times during border skirmishes and conflicts. The combat record was mixed at best, with J-7 struggling against more modern Indian aircraft. Pakistan continued operating J-7s well into the 2000s, despite their obsolescence. This reflected Pakistan's economic constraints and dependence on Chinese military equipment. They couldn't afford Western fighters in sufficient numbers and relied on cheap Chinese aircraft. Some remain in Pakistani service today in training and secondary roles. The long Pakistani service shows both the aircraft's affordability and Pakistan's limited options. It's unclear whether this represents loyalty to China or simple desperation for affordable fighters. Probably both, combined with the reality that something is better than nothing in air defense. 7. Ejection seat problems. Early, J-7 ejection seats were notoriously unreliable, killing pilots who attempted to eject from disabled aircraft. Chinese manufacturing quality in the 1960s and 1970s was poor, and the ejection seat suffered from this. Pilots died from ejection seat failures almost as often as from combat or accidents. The seats failed to fire, fired incorrectly, or separated improperly. This made the J-7 deadlier to its own pilots than to enemies. Later variants improved significantly, particularly after China obtained Russian ejection seat technology and upgraded their manufacturing processes. But decades of pilots flew with unreliable life-saving equipment, knowing that pulling the ejection handle might not work. This manufacturing deficiency killed Chinese and export operator pilots unnecessarily. It represents the human cost of China's early industrial limitations and poor quality control in critical systems. 6. Gunsight primitive. Most J-7 variants had only basic optical gun sights with no radar ranging or computing assistance. Pilots aimed their guns like World War II fighter pilots, using basic optical reticles and estimation. There was no radar to calculate range, closure rate, or lead. Some late variants added simple ranging radars, but most relied on pilot skill and guesswork. This was 1950s technology persisting into the 2000s. Modern fighters have sophisticated fire control computers that calculate ballistics automatically. The J-7 pilot had to manually estimate everything. Gunnery accuracy was terrible as a result. Hitting a maneuvering target required exceptional skill and luck. The primitive fire control made the J-7's gun nearly useless in modern air combat. It was a Stone Age weapon system in a Jet Age aircraft, highlighting how obsolete the design had become. 5. Iraqi war disaster. Iraqi J-7s were massacred by American F-15s during the Gulf War. They achieved 0 kills while suffering multiple losses. Every engagement ended with the J-7 being shot down or fleeing. The combat performance was so poor it became a textbook example of technological mismatch. Iraqi pilots and J-7s were utterly helpless against modern Western fighters with beyond visual range missiles and advanced radars. The J-7's primitive sensors meant Iraqi pilots often didn't know F-15s were there until missiles were already inbound. This real combat data proved the J-7 was completely obsolete against modern opposition. Export customers learned the lesson painfully. The aircraft that looked acceptable on paper was revealed as a death trap in actual warfare. The Gulf War exposed the massive capability gap between 1950s Chinese copies and 1970s American designs.
4. Super 7/FC-1 evolution. China attempted to modernize the J-7 with the Super 7 program, trying to upgrade it into a contemporary fighter.
The program failed completely because the basic airframe was unfixable. Engineers realized they needed to change so much that it would become an entirely different aircraft. The Super 7 eventually evolved into the JF-17 Thunder, which shares almost nothing with the J-7 except the general size category. This proved the J-7 design was beyond salvaging. You couldn't put modern avionics, weapons, and engines on the 1950s airframe and create a competitive fighter. The fundamental limitations were too severe. China had to start over from scratch with a clean sheet design. 3. North Korea rejected it. Even North Korea, desperate for any military equipment, rejected Chinese J-7s and preferred their existing Soviet MiG-20s. That's how bad the Chinese manufacturing quality was. North Korea, not known for high standards, looked at the J-7 and said, no thanks. They trusted 1960s Soviet-built MiGs more than 1980s Chinese copies of the same design. This represents the ultimate insult to Chinese manufacturing capability. When the world's most isolated and impoverished nation rejects your fighter jets, that's a damning assessment. North Korea's rejection showed that Chinese quality control was so poor that even desperate customers wouldn't accept the aircraft. The few J-7s North Korea did acquire were reportedly cannibalized for parts rather than flown. 2. Still flying today. Incredibly, some air forces still operate J-7s in 2024. Bangladesh, Myanmar, and Zimbabwe continue flying these 1950s design fighters because they literally cannot afford anything better. These are among the world's poorest nations with minimal defense budgets. The J-7s they operate are flying death traps by modern standards, hopelessly outclassed by any contemporary fighter. They maintain them through sheer determination and desperation, cannibalizing aircraft for spare parts. These jets wouldn't survive 5 minutes against modern opposition, but they're better than having no air force at all. Pilots flying J-7s today are operating 1950s technology in the 2020s, facing threats designed for modern warfare. 1. Built to fill factories. Here's the ultimate absurd truth. China continued J-7 production for decades, not because of military need, but to keep aircraft factories employed. It was essentially a jobs program disguised as defense manufacturing. The government couldn't shut down state-owned aviation factories without massive unemployment and political consequences. So they kept ordering J-7s nobody wanted or needed. Quality didn't matter, capability was irrelevant. Military value was zero. What mattered was keeping tens of thousands employed. China stockpiled thousands of obsolete jets or dumped them on poor countries at rock-bottom prices. Military effectiveness was sacrificed entirely for industrial policy and employment. And there you have it. 15 facts proving the Chengdu J-7 was a 1950s copy. China couldn't stop building for economic reasons. Which fact shocked you most? North Korea rejecting it or the jobs program revelation? Drop your thoughts below, hit like, subscribe for more aviation truth, and we'll see you in the skies.